All right, I think we're recording. Cool. So, welcome back. And today we're going to pick up our discussion of Peter Attia's book, Outlive, and the general concepts around that book about what it means to be healthy, to live well, live long, all those kind of things. And last time we had covered quite a bit, and one of my good friends and colleague listened to it, and he really wanted to emphasize this centenarians blue zone concept. And his big takeaway was that um, I think we emphasize how important genes are, and that probably is true. But what's also really important and a big um, common factor between all the blue zones are, they're the regular stuff that we know we should be doing. Basically, community, they all had sense of communities, and we had discussed a lot of this. Uh, but they actually, a lot of them do focus on a vegetarian heavy diet. Uh, I'm not saying 100% vegetarian, but compared to the modern, American standards of how much people consume food, they consume, probably 70 to 80% vegetable based diet and maybe 20% meat products. And so we talked about the community aspect was, and community aspect was really important, not necessarily because, they had an inherent sense of, oh, I love the people around me. No, it was more maybe just out of necessity and situation. Most people in that era, out of lack of mobility, were born and died in the same town, and that kind of forced them to, love thy neighbor, and kind of created those long-lasting relationships and bonds where they could they could have different opinions, but they will still hear each other out. Um, so it's just kind of the serotonin type model. And modern day, you don't like somebody, you don't have to talk to your neighbor anymore. You can just go to Facebook and join whatever group and be on Instagram, and the algorithm will find you friends. So you don't really have to foster long-term relationships with people you may not even like. So I think that kind of a, a forced submission into a society that you became fond of and you grew to love is probably part of just being less angry all the time. When we talk about activity, I think generally what we discuss, just like right now, a lot of people think working out is going to the gym, and in a lot of these blue zones, activity is just part of life. In these European and Asian cultures, they probably lived in such harsh environment where they're walking up and down every day. And we talked about this. Even in America, there's some blue zones in California, but I think culturally and religiously, these people just are very outdoorsy. They, like weekly hikes are probably just part of life. Um, and yeah, so I think that's probably pretty much probably covers it. Do you have anything else to say, Evan?
No, I don't think I have anything to add there.
Oh,
So,
great.
yeah, I think we covered the community piece pretty well. It would be interesting I haven't looked up the diet piece to see what to see how they relate across the different blue zones. I can tell you, having lived in Okinawa, it's just dotted with farms. The entire island is every almost if you have unless you're living in a high rise or something, you probably have a little garden in your house, in your backyard, and you're actively cultivating it. And so that is definitely, I would say, they eat vegetables for them, and certainly they eat fish, more fish than us too, and they eat meat, but they certainly eat a lot of vegetables.
But is the eating of vegetable, is it out of necessity, or is it kind of a hobby? And having these gardens, like, well, why do they do that? because they, I mean, they have access to supermarkets, right?
Yeah, so and a lot of their supermarkets are selling, even if, I mean, they had farmers markets too, but I feel like you go to the farmers market, you go to the supermarket, they're kind of all packaged very similarly. So I'm guessing that a lot of this stuff is grown locally, whether you're buying it at the supermarket or at the farmers market. Um, and I don't think it's, I don't know, like necessity meaning like just had to make an income, had to earn a living or what, but I think it's been passed down. I mean, this is just speculation, but I think it's been passed down. It's a very poor, I think it's the poorest prefecture Okinawa is. Um, and I think a lot of what they do, a lot of people live there, stay there, and how to, they learn from their parents and grandparents and things. Um, yeah, so I don't know what the necessity piece is, but they keep it up, you know.
So do you think it's more also the cheaper option to have your own garden than having to go to a traditional supermarket?
I,
Not sure.
I'm sure there's, yeah, I'm sure for some people, but I
Yeah,
don't know. Again, like all the farms that you see, I don't know if what they're doing with that produce. I don't know if the majority of them are selling to some market or if they're using that for themselves or what's going on. But um, I can tell you, well, anyways, yeah, there are certain things there that they grow there. Like uh, in Japan, fruit is known to be very expensive. They do, they would grow like you would go out when you get outside of the cities, north on the islands, you see greenhouses. They have mangoes and pineapples and things, and they are very expensive in the supermarket. So what haven't?
and maybe I mean Japan is a, you know, it's an island nation with limited resource, so it's possible that a lot of what they have to you know, there's a lot of costs associated with even food. It looks like they are growing some things, but even then they have to import um, probably fertilizer and other commodities. So I'm sure there's some inflation. Yeah, I think the economy since the 80s has also been deflationary and kind of slow. Some consider it a miracle of how it really functions. Um, but
Yeah, and
but
I don't know how much their what their life expectancy is today. I think this whole blue zone idea for them is probably a little outdated. I don't know if they have more centenarians now than before. What?
fair enough, fair enough. Okay, okay. But yeah, so um, probably growing, and then I mean growing your own food, and there's so many benefits. You're getting nutritious food, you know what's going in. I mean, probably epitome of what's organic. Plus, I mean, tending a garden is you're squatting, you're bending over. I mean, it's good work for the body in terms of, you know, getting that free exercise.
Yeah, and I can say I haven't been to. I've so spent. My wife is Korean, so spent a lot of time in Korea and Japan. I kind of traveled around Japan and Okinawa, like I said. Definitely different than the United States with regards to farming. And throughout Korea, same thing, same picture. I mean, Seoul's really built up, but as soon as you get outside of that radius of huge buildings, you start to see farms everywhere. Even and my in-laws have a farm. They garden from their farm. It's maybe half an acre. They grow onions, potatoes, peppers, tomatoes, all like several crops, cabbage, and they make kimchi. So that like a lot of what they produce, they're using.
No,
They
it's
sell some of
this.
it.
Okay, but most of the purpose of the farm, it's not a commercial product. It's a more of to consume for the family.
It really is. I mean, I'm sure they give some to other family. Uh, Father-in-law rents out part of his land to somebody else to farm. There's a little bit of profit making there, but yeah, I think it's mostly to feed themselves, and I don't think that's unique to them. I think that's happening lots. Like I said, you see these little farms. You don't really see you see bigger farms, but not like you do here. You see more of like these half-acre farms. I
I
think
see.
that's what people do. I think there's a real you're really in touch with the earth in that way, and the growing of food and cooking. And I don't know the statistics. I don't know their life expectancy versus ours, but I can certainly tell you if I just, N of 2 or N of 4, if I compare my parents to her parents, in general, her parents are a little bit more, they're same age, but they're getting around much
Oh,
easier than my
I see.
parents.
In America, I mean, with COVID, a lot of people got into backyard gardening, and I think people are getting over it as things have opened up and people travel and, they don't want to tend their gardens. Outside of that, micro gardening, I think what you're describing, only thing I can think of in America is the winery business. I think people love getting these kind of, kind of half acre, maybe acre plot of lands and going at it. And I mean, it's a sport of kind of well-off people. Not anybody can play there. That's the
Right,
only thing I can think of because every other farming is heavily commercialized. Which good thing is food becomes extremely cheap and much cheaper than you would because if they're using resources like this industrial farming machines run by diesels and a lot of tech too. Just some of these tractors are like I think autonomous at this point. So
but I wonder, but it's heavily subsidized as well, and really dependent on year to year weather variations. I just wonder, I don't know if it's subsidized in those countries, but I wonder if it's more sustainable having, as opposed to just having huge farms. Everybody's kind of doing a little bit, or more people are farming. I don't know.
yeah, I mean it'd definitely be more resilient as we worry about supply chain issues if everything is done in one giant field and trying to make it less chemicals. You're at risk of big contaminations from either pests or pests is a big thing I can think of if you just have fields of corns. Uh,
Right,
Whereas it's a small garden, I mean that's gonna be mixed vegetables. So I mean like even the
mm,
Native Americans did those three sisters, just kind of smaller
right,
scale, multiple different things. It just has benefits.
right,
But it's hard to discount what we can accomplish. I mean, other goal. But there's a reason some of these things are subsidized by governments globally. I mean, many governments subsidize food just because it's a miracle that I mean we have the luxury of discussing what kind of food to eat. This you will die at 60. Maybe 100 years ago. Now 80 to 100 years life expectancy is increasing, and we have luxury of like well we could extend our life expectancy maybe 20%. But the fact that I don't have to worry about food at all, I just go to supermarket, Costco, Walmart, and like I know there will be food there tomorrow. I mean, we saw just a hint of things might run out. What happened as COVID was getting started? I mean, it gets crazy real quick, and that was just toilet paper and Kleenex. Just like food supply chains were still going. So it's that's probably another takeaway. And food security is very very important, and it's awesome that we don't have to think about it day to day. And we can focus on all these other things that we do as humanity. Um, but while appreciating that, I think it is also good if you're able and capable with time and money to try your hand at maybe gardening or at least just maybe try to just get organic stuff or just eat vegetables. I mean, that's probably the easy part. Don't eat. Just go through that grocery aisle, not just the deli aisle. Or,
right,
or maybe if you're not even going to the grocery store, maybe you're just going and getting fast food most of the time, which is also incredibly cheap for ridiculous reasons.
oh yeah.
Um, Okay, so we can move on to next chapter, chapter 5, Eat Less, Live Longer, the Science of Hunger and Health. All right, Evan. What do
I,
you
I
think?
think we talked about this one. I mean, he mainly, so I think he opens, this is the one where he opens the chapter going to Easter Island.
Oh, I
The
see. I see.
rapamycin, mTOR, all that stuff. I think this is what was
Okay,
in that
okay.
one.
Fair enough, fair enough. We can talk about chapter 6, the crisis of abundance. Can our ancient genes cope with our modern diet? I think the titles are at least are connected, like
Right.
in the past, we used to have prolonged periods of hunger, and that's what our body probably evolved with. That's what our genes are designed for. And now we live in this modern environment, like just talked, we have so much food easily available. There's really no need to starve. If you're starving your kids, probably get CPS called on you. It's probably, and if but going 100 years back, I mean, children starving was probably a lot more common. And granted, infant mortality and child mortality was significantly higher too. So I think this access of abundance has helped um, children live and live into their adulthood. Wow, what else do you have to say about this?
Yeah, so he talks about, I guess for him, he was, he went back to residency. He was doing some case, a colorectal cancer case, and they got into the abdomen, and this guy had fatty liver disease, noticeably, right? Um, and they were worried that it was from alcoholic, like at the time, it wasn't well known that this non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, it was presumed to be due to alcoholism. And that was kind of like the beginnings, or at least like it wasn't as well known, this epidemic that we're facing, obesity and NAFLD. So that was kind of the backdrop, I think, of the introduction of the thrifty gene or hypothesis or whatever theory, whatever, and just again going back to medicine 3.0. What's going to show up when somebody has? So you probably treat plenty of people with NAFLD or
Oh yeah.
NASH. Like, what do you see? Like, how do you treat when you see? I don't know. When do you do? How do you do routine lab work? What's your yearly or whatever? I don't know. Lab work.
So talking about kind of liver disease, I work in a hospital setting as an internal medicine doctor. So it's um, oftentimes I see patients at the later stage of their liver disease. Um, and for people who don't know, we've been talking about liver disease that's not alcoholic. Traditionally, we figured out drinking too much alcohol kills people's liver, and you could see that in autopsies, liver just looked very nodular, uh, and people get jaundice. So those are all traditionally, thousands of years ago. I think people figured out there was, someone looking yellow has something to do with bile and liver. But um, recently, as we have entered this era of calorie access, non-alcohol fatty liver disease um, has become in the top three causes of dying livers. Uh, and oftentimes, sometimes it can show up in lab works, like Evan was mentioning. There's liver enzymes that are regular doctor can order, um, and if they're slightly abnormal, the next step is typically, okay, let's get some sort of imaging, maybe ultrasound, uh, and then there are some other scans they can do to kind of look at how fatty the liver is. Uh, but so I don't necessarily get to see that side of it, even though I know what they do in the clinic. Most people who go through these kind of issues, I feel like, don't get to have the discussion with their doctor. A lot of them come in with cirrhosis, which is the state of the liver that has failed and is dying, with little hope of rescue. And and those patients typically say, like, no one ever told me I had a liver problem. Everybody told me they had diabetes, they had all these other things that go with obesity, but they never said, like they had liver problem. Now, there's probably some bias because I work in the hospital. People who are coming to the hospital with these things probably are the type of people who either have poor access to the primary doctors or uh, for whatever reason, maybe they don't have insurance or they just work too much or maybe they don't have a good doctor. I don't know. But and 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 people who do have access to insurance and doctors, that presumably getting that sorted out, realizing they have this fatty liver disease, and they're making those changes and not having to come to the ER in the hospital. I mean, I know doctors who have this. They don't look obese, but they know they have elements of metabolic syndrome based on laboratory testing, and they try to do the right thing, and they don't have to come to the hospital in the state of liver failure.
Yeah, I think he says so NASH being the spectrum being non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, kind of leading to NASH, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, kind of inflammation in the liver before reaching cirrhosis. But he said NASH accounted for 1% of liver transplants in 2001, and by 2025 it'll be the leading indication for transplants,
Oh
which is crazy
wow,
to think.
that is crazy.
So this is all part of that, of the kind of the metabolic syndrome, that, or the increase in metabolic syndrome that we're seeing today. It's like in obesity and um, amongst other things, diabetes. We can go over the diagnostic criteria for metabolic syndrome, but essentially, this is like, what, in my mind, this is where it all starts, and this is what the media covers too, and I think it's important. They're talking about the obesity epidemic, but he kind of wants to say, and I think he has a certain way of saying things to try to put things in his favor. But he basically makes a big point of saying that your BMI or being overweight or obese doesn't necessarily mean that you're metabolically unhealthy, and vice versa. You can be metabolically unhealthy, or you can be not obese and be metabolically unhealthy. So really taking, again, his 3.0 approach is like, let's start measuring these things, the metabolic health of a person, well before they reach these stages. And for the liver, obviously getting the liver enzymes, ALT, AST, um, for, and he talks about insulin resistance, um, like, paying attention to people's blood pressure, not being okay. I see patients, and I'm dealing with a very healthy population. I should be like young military members, and it's crazy how many times I see people 130s, 140s systolic in their 20s.
Hmm.
And I'm like, and so lately I've just been like, I'm not a primary care doctor, but I'm gonna get on to you about this, and we're gonna figure this out. This is not okay. And you look back in their charts, and it's not just a one-time thing. So I think it's anyways, I think I like that approach. I think it's one area, hard to prevent cancers to a large extent. I mean, certainly things you cannot smoke, but um, a lot of times bad luck. Um, Cardiovascular disease, again, definitely things you can do to help prevent that. But I do think like your metabolic disorder is something that if you can recognize it early, even late, I mean, you can do something about it. It's in your control. And for me, I think a lot of it starts with that, is figuring out where you are and going from there. I personally went through the whole thing, all the labs and like glucose tolerance test and and fasting insulin, everything. It's kind of funny because I probably the people that care about it most don't need it, but Anyways, it was interesting. It was fun to see. It was fun to see the results. I kind of had a little the way the lab messed it up, and so I was kind of worried for a little bit, but I figured it out.
Yeah. So since you should, I mean, metabolic syndrome is a huge part of healthcare. I mean, it's like one of the. I think he uses the four horsemen thing, and that's like one of the big horsemen or one big pillar. If you could solve all the metabolic syndrome on this planet from humans, it's I mean you there'd be such a big shift in healthcare. I mean, and uh, I mean that would be a wonderful world from my standpoint. But it's the most frustrating disease to have. I don't even know if I should call it disease. It's all I mean, it's a syndrome. Sure, we can call it disease, but it's the most frustrating because every doctor will tell you. I mean, it's the inclination. Our insight is that it should be preventable 100%. Which we can't say that about cancer because all sorts of people get cancer that may not have rhyme or reason, though we think there may be some connection with metabolic syndrome. But diabetes, fatty liver disease, I mean, blood pressure, all these things, you can kind of guess that if you have it, you don't reverse things will kind of go in the wrong direction. And there are a lot of people who take it seriously once they've been told they have metabolic syndrome, and then they take the right things, which is not rocket science, like to spoiler alert, diet and exercise. Like once you become obsessed with that, you reverse it, and then you stick to a good diet and exercise regimen. You continue to avoid it, and so that's why it's the most frustrating part. And there's a lot of elements of probably you know, public shaming in the sense that there are all these movements about how we view people who should be making good decisions but aren't. From insurance standpoint, I mean, is it fair to care for people's heart bypass surgery if they have been smoking all their life? I mean, that kind of thing. So does that also extend to, oh, if you've been eating McDonald's all your life, should I pay for your bypass as an insurance premium payer or taxpayer for that matter? So I think it creates this kind of tension in society on what we can do. If everybody agrees it's preventable, well, why does it still exist? So I think the exciting part is I think at least I think it's a fixable problem if we can work on the society as opposed to like cancer, which I think it's still fixable. Cancer is, but I think it will require a lot more technological innovation. Whereas fixing metabolic syndrome, I don't think we need more breakthroughs. Though some things like these new drugs that GLP-1s like Ozempic and Mounjaro, those are great, but I mean they're not needed. They're not necessary. I'm sure people find them helpful. So why don't you, since we talked about metabolic syndrome, Evan, how would you describe it to a layperson?
I would try to describe it as how you metab how so you could either describe it by its like diagnostic criteria, or you could describe it like how I think of it as how you take in nutrients and what your body does with those nutrients. And it's fascinating to me because actually it's probably my favorite subject right now because I'm a surgeon, right? I care about metabolic syndrome. But essentially I've always enjoyed sugar, so I've always like taking, you know, high glucose or fructose meals is pleasurable to me. But and so what happens? What's the fate of that sugar? What's the fate of the fat, the protein, what have you? And to me, the most probably, I mean, I guess probably fat and sugar are the two big players there, right? We're talking about the macronutrients. From a sugar standpoint, you ingest sugar. A lot of times, whatever form that's in, you're going to have some percentage of glucose and fructose. But let's say it's glucose. It's going to have a fate, right? And it's going to either go probably to be stored or be used immediately if you're like actively exercising. Um, and if it's stored, it's going to be either stored just to get it. Maybe we'll get into the weeds a little bit, but you're either going to store a lot of like most of your it gets stored as glycogen, and the majority of your glycogen stores are in your muscles. And I think that's important. It's been kind of a, I mean, we learned that in medical school, but to me, it's an important point as someone who's not super muscular. I think it's building a little bit of muscle again gives you a little bit more storage reservoir for the sugar. But then it also gets stored in the liver as glycogen, and some of it it's if those stores are full, or maybe even if they're not full, but for certain percentage is going to get stored as fat. It's going to get converted to fat. Um, and so you can think of it as how your body so metabolically, how does it take in that energy and store that energy versus get or use it immediately or start getting rid of it in times of like heavy exercise or whatever. That's what I think about metabolic. And you say disorder, it's like something isn't something going on there is leading to the diagnostic criteria of being hypertensive, central obesity, diabetes, high or low HDL, things like that. So if the disorder comes from some abnormality, we would say in the function of that, or the fate of those nutrients.
Yeah, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's really good way of putting it. So I think most of what you said, I agree with. Just um, I think the idea of thinking of it just what the body does with food, because food is basically 100% of what metabolic syndrome is about, how your body um, consumes it. It goes from um, even the desire to eat probably is tightly linked into metabolic disorders. And I'm using disorder and syndrome interchangeably. I mean, there's some differences, but the ideas are the same in my opinion for the discussion. Uh, so yeah, so I mean, we talked about the two the macronutrients. The glucose is kind of the carb, the simplified carb, which is designed to be consumed quickly. The fats are something that, they're, if you think about the fire, I mean, the glucose is kind of like the spark or the tinder, like the app, uh, or if you're starting a fire, like those kind of loose grasses, that kind of dried leaves that will burn quickly. And fat is like that fat log that is going to sit there and just burn all night. It may not give you a huge flame, but it'll generate a lot of heat. Um, so um, and there's third one called like the protein, which everybody has heard of protein, like just glucose and fat. Everybody's familiar with these. But protein is mostly it's the one, it's the only one that would have a nitrogen group. It's designed for uh, it's more of a tool for machinery in the body, and the machinery can be there are all sorts of machinery. I mean, from cells have probably millions of different machinery. Really, some of uh, yeah. So cell would have multiple different machinery in it, and so we want that there is a concept that we how much protein one needs to eat. So we'll discuss that later because I think that's more controversial. But glucose and fat. So we talked about the log strategy analogy, but for the, the glucose will all of this goes to the gut, right? And the glucose does, liver has a huge role to play for both the glucose and the fat. And yes, the glucose can ultimately turn into fat, and there are all these intermediary steps. But the connection is hormonal in one way. Of what decides, like, should I just not eat any glucose then? But if I do that, will I not have all these nasty things like diabetes and blood pressure issues? Uh, and uh, and the answer may be quite possibly, though that statement by itself is probably very hard to execute. Yeah, same thing with fat. I mean, traditionally, in the 60s, 70s, I think we went through this kind of very anti-fat, low-fat yogurt, don't eat fat, fat gives you cholesterol, this kind of rhetoric in the advertising and media, and I think intentions were probably good, but now we're realizing maybe that was kind of a misstep in our desire to reduce heart attacks and strokes and all these things that can happen with metabolic disorders, because we made up for the lack of fat by adding a lot more sugar. So for the layperson, I think the statement stands, and we can go into a lot more details of why, that of all the three macronutrients, carbs, especially the simple carbs like glucose or fructose or lactose or galactose, these tend to really mess with the hormonal um, equilibriums of your body. Your body's used to a certain world, and that world typically doesn't have as much of these simple carbs. Historically, and evolutionary, if you think, how the man lived a million years ago, than today. So it's a big shock. In the spirit of this chapter of like ancient genes coping with our modern diet, I think that's probably the biggest uh, issue, is that um, we are not built to have so much simple sugars in our life, or simple carbs in our life. Um, I don't think that applies to fat. I think if you eat too much fat, you will likely have diarrhea, and I think there's limited um, ability for you to absorb that fat. Um, we may be getting a little off course. We can go deeper and deeper into different aspects of our mental models on how to think about glucose and fat metabolisms. Do you have anything to add, Evan?
I would say, yeah. I mean, I agree with what you said. I like the log burning model. Um, to get a little bit into the endocrine piece. So, one thing I find fascinating that he kind of talked. He had this guy Gerald Schulman on his podcast, and he talks about him in the book. But his theory is, he's a diabetologist, essentially endocrinologist, diabetologist. Um, After 30 years of research, he thinks that, so you take in his glucose load, high sugar meal or whatever, your body produces insulin, and the insulin is going to help drive sugar into let's say, the myocyte or the muscle cell. How does it do that? It acts on a receptor on the cell surface. This leads to a chain of events that leads to more, basically putting glucose transporters on the cell surface. That's letting glucose in. And whenever you become insulin resistant, your cells aren't responding to that same level of insulin, right? For whatever reason. So that's the question, is why. So there's multiple questions. Well, so the insulin your pancreas ends up producing more insulin in order to drive the sugar into the cell, right? Over time, as you get worse and worse, get more and more resistant to the insulin, your pancreas will kind of burn out, in a way, the cells that produce the insulin. But that's much later. But like, what is causing the insulin resistance? I think is kind of fascinating. According to him, there is so he basically showed he can measure the downstream effects of the insulin receptor, the enzymes that are being produced as a result of that dimerization and then intracellular cascade. He can measure along the way, like several steps along the way, and he can see if the insulin binds here, and I don't remember the name of all the cascade, but of every piece along the way. But you measure, let's say, the next step of that reaction, and then the next step, and the next step. And if you can measure all those, then you can kind of see where the backup is. Like, where is this? If the insulin's hitting the receptor, and if it's the next step after it hits the receptor, then you would expect to see a high level in the previous sections and not in the later sections, right? So if you can measure all those things, and basically he showed that it was everything within the cell was not going up, and so the insulin was binding to the receptor, but it was not causing an intracellular effect of putting more glucose channels in. And his theory, he basically administered heparin to mice, which interestingly causes cells to uptake um, triglyceride. So these cells end up having more intracellular triglyceride, which is kind of analogous to someone who's overweight. Same thing. You're going to see the same thing for someone who's overweight. So when he did that, he gets the same effect. And so he thinks there's some sort of, I think this is what he's basically saying, there's some sort of mechanical barrier, mechanical obstruction of the insulin binding, and just the intracellular components aren't able to work as well because of this high density of lipid in the cell, triglyceride in the cell. So anyways, to me, it's a fascinating model. Like, if you can, it kind of gets into lipid metabolism. And if you can correct lipid metabolism, you can maybe correct diabetes metabolism or sugar metabolism, and kind of the whole, everything's tied together, right? So again, getting your metabolic house in order. I don't know. What do you think of that? What do you think of that model?
I think I don't know about the heparin the mouse model. I'm not too familiar with it, but I mean, yes. So I mean, to simplify, there's so many arms to the metabolic syndrome pathways. It affects so many things. So I think it would be helpful to just, for most people, just focus on glucose and fructose as your simple sugars, because I think it's relatable, and focus on insulin and kind of drop everything else for now. So, and the idea that, we talked about mTOR and all these pathways that are important for metabolism, and they act through how there's a cell, could be a muscle cell, a fat cell, a liver cell, but a lot of these cells are kind of like cities, with their own kind of rules and functions, and they can communicate with everything that is not that cell through these different molecules. And mTOR is a molecule that affects some cells, and the insulin is a molecule that affects a lot of cells. And insulin is as a hormone is basically, I think Peter Attia talks about it in this way, is a food sensor of sort. That's kind of the evolutionary. That's kind of the role because for each cell, it's important. Each cell wants to live well and long, and access to food and nutrition is a huge signal to navigate the world, especially when our cells have given up ability to move, get their own food, eat other smaller cells. Our cells have kind of gotten rid of all that capability. So, but in exchange, there's a kind of this law or that the rule the body has created. Well, the body will create these hormones that will let the cell know what the state of food is, and so cell can focus on whatever the cell. If the muscle cell is specialized into just having a lot of protein and those fibers that work as a muscle. Um, but that signaling works, but there are always loopholes, and we didn't know about the loopholes till we had this kind of food access. And when you throw a lot of um, unchecked glucose without any starvation, you create a state that is flooded with insulin. So in a metabolic syndrome patient, you more often than not have high levels of insulin in your body, and this is what your cells see, this high level of insulin all the time. It's that we don't know what, like, cells start to change and they kind of forget what a time was where there was not this much insulin. An analogy, maybe, I don't know, I feel like it's an adequate analogy. It might be social media. As a social media, once you start using social media, which has only existed for maybe 10, 15 years, it's hard to know of a world where we didn't have that, where we didn't have quick access to send messages to people instantly. Now we have feeds, but even email is only 20 years old, maybe 30 years old. So it's kind of similar concept to from the sales point of view, that when we think of social media, we have this idea of it's good to have a break. I'm taking a cleanse from social media. I'm just not gonna check anything for a week. I'm gonna travel and not think about things, think about work. So that kind of it. We are intuitively, we have this idea, that will help reset something, and I think that's kind of the same concept can be applied to, I think, cells that are constantly seeing all this insulin, which is your body just trying to say, hey, there's food, there's food, there's food. And you don't have any significant time periods without this easy to work with food molecules, glucose and fructose. So this, I think that's the big change. That when a cell has all this signaling about food, it is designed to do something with the food, either try to grow, because when you have food, you try to turn on things that help you grow and expand, um, or you try to store it. I mean, those are your only two things. So if you so that's what people say, insulin is a growth factor, because when you have food, you will, if you're a child, it's probably a good thing because you want to grow. But when you're a obese, 35-year-old person, that probably means that signal, the continuous signal to grow, is harmful to your body. Uh, yeah, I think that. What do you think?
Yeah, I was gonna relate it to he does talk about how there's this, a certain level of subcutaneous fat is healthy, right? Is
Yeah.
normal and healthy, and actually, again, it's serving as a reservoir for nutrients and for energy. And he does. I'll kind of go off on a little bit of a tangent, but he talks about a very interesting theory about why we have maybe our ability to store fat a little bit better than maybe some other organisms. But there was this team of people who their theory is that when the primates of Africa migrated north into Europe, they this was during like warmer times, and they would eat a lot of fruits, a lot of figs, and those were present in the forests of Europe at that time. But then as the weather started getting colder and winter started getting more harsh, the forest changed, and there were some genetic alteration mutations that ended up being better adaptive to that. And one of them was this uricase, or like you being able to metabolize uric acid, and how that. I think there was one more. They didn't name the enzyme, but basically those individuals that had malfunctioning uricase enzymes, or silenced, they ended up being able to store fat better.
Oh,
And because that's all that has to do with the fructose metabolism pathway. And that enzyme, which is present in other mammals and isn't present in us, helps us store fat better. And then they migrated back down to Africa, and then eventually they turned into Homo sapien, and then we kind of had that alteration. But anyways, so then there's that. So our ability to store fat, and now basically the theme of that chapter is like you said in the beginning, the environment in which we're living changed way quicker than we could evolve to deal with that, to adapt to that, right? So that, you know, think about evolution. I mean, this is basically happening over. I mean, how soon has it been in our history that we've had access to food like this? Like 100 years, maybe less,
less. It has to be
right?
on a global scale. I'm sure it started off in certain communities, but now I think most of the world has super easy access to, like,
Yeah,
reliably.
maybe like in the 1500s or 1400s or 1300s, they had, the wealthy, the noble, or had this access, but not the regular person, right? But now everybody has access
I mean, even
to
Great
this.
Depression, I mean, I think people, I mean, granted, it was kind of low point in the economy, but even our depressions haven't been this bad. There have been
Right.
large famines where people have died as part of different cultures and different countries, but nothing has been. I think as we have become more globalized, it has helped us have much more reliable access to food.
And then on top of that, I think, and something maybe people don't talk as much about, simultaneously, while we're having this great access to food, we also have great access to medicine, right? So like you can withstand certain things better, being nu- having access to the nutrients, and then being unhealthy as a result, but being able to survive because you have access to other things. So being metabolically unhealthy, but still being able to survive. And I don't know how much that plays into currently the metabolic syndrome as we're seeing it as an epidemic, but like as far as how does that change our reproductive capabilities, I'm not sure. But certainly kids nowadays, I expect that you will see the consequences of metabolic syndrome in young people who haven't procreated. How is that going to play out, and how is that going to affect our evolution as a species? I don't know, but like, anyways, point is like evolution acts on hundreds of thousands of years, not more, right? Not on the last 75 years or whatever it is that we've had this access. So I believe that. I think it's certain that we have the access to the calories, and our body's ability to our I do believe our bodies want to store that energy when it comes in and it's available. We will store it because we didn't always have access to it like we do now. So I do believe that's true. Um, and then so like, but a certain level of fat is kind of normal. But then when you keep on adding it, it starts getting added to the wrong places, right? It starts getting added to visceral areas around the heart, around the pancreas, around the kidneys, around the intestines. in places that it shouldn't be, and you end up seeing elevated inflammatory markers in those individuals, and it's kind of is that the theory, or I don't know, maybe it's already proven that like that inflammation um, is is bad for those organs, and maybe bad for the entire body, causing an increase, cancer and things like that. So, um, I don't know. I really think getting a grip on metabolism, or excuse me, metabolism, like getting a grip on your diet, and you can also that includes exercise because that's going to help you get through some of these sugars that you're eating. I think it's critical finding that early, and even if it's or at any time, correcting it. Um, Getting your metabolic health in order. I think that's so important for us to live healthily.
So what do you think is from visually, what does a healthy human body look like? What like should we all have six packs? Should we, have like, dad bods with a
I
little
don't have a
belly?
six pack, so we can't be six pack. Um, no, I think the you know I think the BMI is an okay thing for the average person. If you use the BMI as a measure, 18 to 25, I think that's okay. Um, if you're more muscular, I don't think being more muscular, building muscle is a bad thing. Now, I do think focusing on muscle and becoming a, you know, jacked, look in the mirror, look at me type of person. I don't know whether that's detrimental, but I also don't know that how helpful it is per se. Especially if you're not taking care of other things, if that's your sole focus and you're still have other metabolic, again, you could probably still accumulate visceral fat and other things and still be muscular. Um, so at the end of the day, I don't know that there's a look, but I do think you could do the lab testing, a lot of these things, and say, how is your metabolic health? And do you meet those diagnostic criteria for the metabolic syndrome? I think they're decent at predicting your overall level of health.
Okay, yeah. So what is BMI? How does that work?
I mean, it's a measure of your height over your weight. So, um, again, if you're, um, is it weight over height, height over weight? Did I say that wrong? Weight over height. Sorry.
Yeah, weight over height. Yeah.
So yeah, so if you put on a lot of muscle, and what muscle tends to weigh a little bit more than fat, then your BMI will go up. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're. This is kind of what I poked at earlier because I think Peter Attia made a he stressed it several times. Like you can be overweight or you can be obese and still not be metabolically unhealthy. You can be metabolically healthy and be obese. And I think he says that in part because he's probably overweight, in part because he's a very muscular person. So like I think that's I don't know. I'm just anyways. So I don't think having a BMI above 25 is a bad thing per se, as long as you're at a metabolic uh the other metabolic pieces are in order, your picture is in order.
I think that's a good way of thinking about it. And I agree. I mean, BMI is a great marker just because how easy it is. It's free to measure. I mean, you can measure it home multiple times. You can track it. So it's a great measure. Um, we have categories like BMI of maybe 19 to 25 is considered normal, and some of these things, some of these brackets may be um, European centric. I mean, I don't know, maybe the scale thresholds should be a little adjusted for people living in Asia or Africa. But largely, I mean, the theme is correct. I mean, we gather all the people and then kind of figure out where most of them are, and then most people who are considered healthy will fall under this kind of BMI of 19 to 25. leaving a lot of room for the difference between men and women, and like I said, ethnicities, and then people who are less than the lower end of the BMI that are probably on the skinnier, underweight side, and people on the larger side are just that they're just bigger than their peers. Now, modern day BMI charts would probably have to adjust because I think on average human on this planet has become much larger. Um, and you can see that if you look at 100-year-old photos of carnivals where people still used to have like a freak show, or people who were, conjoined twins or misfigured, or, there was always a big obese man. Like that person today is
It's
average
the
person.
normal.
Yeah. So it's it's kind of amusing, also kind of sad. Uh, but it's
Well, what was I going to say? Yeah, well, I think the average weight for a male is like 200 now in the United States.
yeah.
200
So
pounds.
so I don't think we need to adjust the BMI. It's like coming to pressures of like like what, like we don't need to redefine what's normal necessary, because I think most people are diabetic or pre-diabetic who have high BMIs. So I think that's a great way to start your journey of trying to be healthy. Start with the BMI. And if you feel like you know you don't necessarily fit, like you may be different, at least you don't have to compare yourself to the standard number, what the brackets tell you who you are, but at least you can compare yourself to yourself and how your BMI, if you're doing a weight loss journey, how it's changing. Um, and, yeah, I mean that whole story of people going into Europe, and with the temperature changes, and I agree. I mean, the subcutaneous fat is probably healthy. I mean, fat provides insulation. Like whales have blubber that's kind of analogous to the subcutaneous fat, which is just fat underneath the skin. So, I mean, there's like you could have abs, but if you have subcutaneous fat, you're not going to feel. You're not able to see those abs. So, able to see those abs, you have to really get rid of the fat from your skin under the stomach. Now, that for aesthetic looks, you don't want that fat there because everybody has abs. It's just how much fat you have on top. But metabolically, that fat probably doesn't have too much to do with. It's not making you unhealthy. Granted, you're not obese, but if you're healthy, you can't get that six pack. I think metabolic, there's no problem. This is more of an aesthetic issue. And we're talking about visceral fat, meaning all this fat that's deeper, because how the body is designed, you have just the torso. If you just look at from kind of neck down to your belly, um, the top part of of your body, has ribs. So all the tissues kind of sit underneath the ribs, and then you just have kind of skin and muscle on top. So if you have fat there, it's just going to be subcutaneous fat. But if as you get on the bottom half of your body, kind of from upper chest to just above the groin, now you're looking at there are no ribs protecting it. Now you have kind of your gut, which is like your bowel on the inside, plus then you have skin and the muscle on the outside, and then you kind of have some space that can um, fill with fat. There's liver there. There are a lot of organs that kind of support the GI system, and that's probably where if you have too much fat, and your body's trying to is freaking out and storing fat in areas it's not supposed to. It's going around the liver, around the gut, um, and sometimes going around the heart, like all these deeper organs. Would you say that's correct?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And so yeah, so and I mean, there are scans people can do if you're really worried. They're not. standard part of medical practices. To your doctor's not just going to order um, a DEXA scan or any scan to just look for all the fat. Maybe they will if you have a discussion that what you're trying to figure out. Um, but that's ultimate. That's the fat we worry about in terms of the harmful.
You can kind of, I think they do those DEXA scans. I think they have like mobile carts and stuff that you can pay for, but Attia orders them on like I think all of his patients.
Oh,
Or
that's okay.
he follows that. I kind of want to get one for that. For interesting to see. What is your? I'm more interested in the lean body mass versus like fat. I'm not too worried about the fat, but
Yeah,
interested to see.
and yeah, I mean they're definitely with. The good thing is I think with social media, I think a lot of these good concepts are also getting a lot of traction. People are learning about um, all these new concepts of insulin resistance and what it means, how it can be if one who wants to be healthy, what the steps to do. Um, and to support them, and a lot of businesses are starting up. They're offering cash based. Your insurance may or may not pay for this, but if you're able to pay cash, there are services now that will help you, you know, get these tests, and they are helpful. One of my friends also gotten it, so maybe I'll consider it. I think these are radiation based tests. I think there is it's like getting it. I don't. It's like getting an X-ray. I don't know about the dose itself. It's probably more than an X-ray, but it does use that ionizing radiation. One can argue, well, flying also gives you some exposure to ionizing radiation, just being in an airplane. But that's probably the only risk I can see, other than it costs you some money. But yeah, and we're talking about workup. I mean, so we talked about BMI is a super easy, cheap thing to do. And the other, and Evan and I had discussed this previously, you can look at your LFTs, they're markers to look at sugar, how does what's your body's relationship with the blood sugar? Because there's always sugar in your blood. There's just because a lot of your body relies on sugar, and there are a lot of mechanisms to keep that sugar at the perfect balance. As you go down these metabolic disorders and things start shifting in a negative manner, your hormones start, your insulin keeps rising, so you can try to peek into how your body's behaving by checking your glucose, which is what we say sugar, we're mainly saying glucose. And you can fast and see what your glucose is. And your doctor does that every time you go see your doctor, for when they make you fast before your labs. So that a fasting glucose is a great way of seeing. If you have high fasting glucose, that means your body's struggling. Your body's not able to bring that glucose back to lower normal levels for some reason. That reason typically is your body has some sort of insulin resistance, where your body's probably producing the hormone insulin because you have high sugar, and but that insulin level is not good enough. That insulin is not working, so you have high sugar. And if you know people, your spouse, your sister has been pregnant, then they probably went through a glucose tolerance test where you measure glucose, you take a shot of some glucose juice or drink, and then you measure glucose again in the blood to see, we're trying to do the same thing. We're trying to peek into uh, your body's ability to metabolize and work, how it handles glucose, which is a unit of calorie for the body. So again, this ultimately we're trying to, in one sentence, we're trying to figure out what the metabolism is like. There's the new thing you probably heard about is insulin resistance, is measuring the insulin levels, which is also not practiced, but I think it's and I think Evan as well, a lot of doctors are starting to see if they maybe just measure the insulin level and see what the insulin levels are like in any state. Even if you don't have, frank diabetes, or you don't look obese, but you're just curious, you did the BMI thing, but you want to get another blood test. So if you get your insulin levels, that may be able to give you more insight in your insulin resistance, with the assumption being high insulin levels mean insulin resistance. And if you have healthy um, metabolism, your insulin levels will be low. So that's the only that's a simple way of thinking about it. That you're trying to measure your insulin levels, and especially fasting, which you're kind of simulating a starving state, uh, and then trying to see, it's not too high. Now, if you're like doing something crazy, you're starving yourself for weeks, which I don't recommend. That's not healthy. Then you know some of these things won't apply because your body goes into different modes, I think. But ultimately, to recap, to start off with BMI, which is free. You can measure your glucose, and you could do that. Go to your local pharmacy and getting a glucose meter. I mean, every diabetic probably has a glucometer. And then maybe working with your doctor and getting some sort of insulin test, maybe a DEXA scan. Like, these are more advanced things. But this would be the journey to try to understand where you are metabolically. You do
Yeah, he says not getting a fasting insulin is beyond. It's basically beyond him that we don't do that for everybody. If like, and I kind of fall in his camp. It's like that's the first thing that's going to show up. That's going to be before glucose is elevated, insulin will be elevated, because your body's like a fasting insulin. If it's elevated, it's producing more insulin than normal to try to get the glucose in, and your body will overcome that eventually. Initially, your body will respond to that elevated insulin and keep the glucose at a normal level, but then it won't. Eventually, it won't, and it's not until much later that you start seeing this bump in A1C. So, like, not using an A1C, even a 5.5 or whatever, like using the A1C is like, why would we not? He kind of likens it to any other endocrine disorder. Like, if you went in and if you were worried you had Cushing's disease and you had cortisol levels checked and this was abnormal, would your doctor just be like, "Oh, whatever, we're not going to do anything about this"? If your TSH was off, "Oh, we're not going to do anything about this," right? No, you're going to investigate and figure out what's going on. So, like, why are we not treating this other endocrine organ in a similar way? And you would catch people much earlier. I think I agree with that. And you could kind of, do you need to do it every year? I don't know if you need to do it every year. I don't know what the cost of the test is, but certainly worth doing. I think starting at a certain age, 30, 40, and in certain populations where, again, if they're meeting this, if they're hypertensive and they have central adiposity and they have a lipid panel already that shows hypertriglyceridemia or hyperlipidemia, like, these are people that you should probably, even if their A1C is normal, I would probably still be getting insulin, fasting insulin.
Yeah, I'm probably on a more aggressive state. I don't even think we, in people who have not have had, known heart disease or cholesterol issues, um, I feel like we get less value from checking LDL and HDL, because I've tried studying this stuff. It still doesn't make sense to me, and how much, you know that stuff is harmful, because there are a lot of people who have high LDL but never really have a problem. Now, if you have a heart attack and you have high LDL, which is like LDL cholesterol, we know that is a big problem, and it should be treated aggressively. Um, but to have high insulin, even though this has not been, it's not standard practice, It's not routinely measured, so we don't necessarily even know what normal or abnormal levels are. It's we're kind of going based on intuition at this point. I think having high insulin levels, I think it's hard to argue that's not causing you harm, knowing what we don't know.
And the treatment isn't a medicine, right? The
Yeah,
treatment's diet and exercise. So there's no harm. Like once you've reached a point where you need a medicine to control your diabetes, it's like, well, you've gone too far. Like, I mean, sure, you could do it. You could still correct it with diet and
yeah.
exercise, but why get there?
Yes, that's the thing. But the biggest pro argument for measuring, fasting insulin is you are probably getting an opportunity to test to look for your metabolic disorders in your body 5 to 10 years in advance. I mean,
At least, yeah.
yeah. So that's a huge leg up. I mean, because what do we do typically, Evan? When we measure, can you try to connect? We typically try to measure glucose and A1C in terms of how what the glucose is doing in the body. And how is that different? I think we covered some of this, like how, I don't know, maybe people don't understand. Can you connect insulin, the pancreas, to glucose in a simplified manner?
Well, let's see if this general surgeon can do this. But basically, the A1C is the glycosylated form of hemoglobin, so it has a sugar on it.
What does
I don't know if it's
glycosylated mean? Yeah, I guess
in
that has sugar on
sugar.
it. Yeah,
I
that's
don't
right.
know if it's. I think it's just a sugar. I don't know the
Yeah, so
exact molecule.
glycosylated means glucose, so there's a glucose molecule attached to the sugar, and we can detect it.
And so
Glucose
there's a
attached to the hemoglobin, and we can.
yeah to the hemoglobin. So there's a certain percentage of that in everybody's blood. A certain percentage of your hemoglobin is glycosylated, and it kind of it changes. Well, let's say this. So this glycosylated version, yeah, I haven't read the studies, but basically it's an indicator of your overall like 90-day level of glucose. They can kind of equate it to a 90-day level of glucose in the body in a way. Like if your hemoglobin A1C is 6.5%, you can assume that that person probably walks around with the hemoglobin glucose probably maybe 110. I don't know, what do you say, 140? I don't know, what is it like,
I don't know the
average
ranges, but
glucose?
yeah, between 100 and 150 is probably a good guess, I would say, for that.
So again, the more sugar you have in your bloodstream, the more likely your hemoglobin is going to get glycosylated, and so your percentage is going to be higher. And over that's kind of a 90-day average, more or less. What does that mean? If you have more sugar in your bloodstream, that's going to cause the release of more insulin from the pancreas, the beta cells of the pancreas. And so it's going to, to try to put that sugar somewhere. That's just a reaction to having sugar. That's when your body absorbs sugar, your pancreas is able to sense this and it produces insulin. And so that insulin is meant to dispose of that sugar appropriately or in some place, right? Like we talked about that earlier. And so um, your level of insulin overall, just like the level of sugar, is going to tell you overall how much sugar is in your body. The difference is, like, again, measuring the insulin is that initially your body will respond to that rise in insulin and it will dispose of that sugar. So even if you were to measure your blood sugar and your A1C and those are normal, you could still have an elevated level of insulin because it's having to dispose of an elevated, because your sugar, your body, your pancreas is responding appropriately and disposing of the sugar appropriately.
So
But
you
event
have high glucose because of these kind of poor diet choices, and then your body is making insulin. It's increasing its insulin production to keep up, and insulin is made by the pancreas, and at some point, I guess the pancreas can't keep up, and it gets exhausted.
right, I mean that's very far down the line. Like you said, we're catching this 5 to 10 years before that
Yeah,
ever
yeah,
happens, at least. Like we're
correct.
talking about a diabetic that may someone who would require insulin, or that happens much later.
So let's talk about somebody where pancreas is producing more, but hasn't gotten exhausted, but is still producing more and keeping the numbers looking normal. But the truth is, pancreas has started working working harder, producing more insulin to normalize the sugar that shows up in tests. So you're in this gray zone where your glucose, your blood glucose numbers actually should be higher, but the pancreas has stepped up and started producing more insulin than you typically would have needed. And when you check for glucose in your blood, it's normal. So your doctor goes, well, your glucose normal, you're healthy. You check your sugar at home, your glucose normal, you're healthy. Everything's great. But we know the pancreas has actually started working overtime to give you these perfect looking lab numbers. Then A1C, the same thing, right? The normal amount of hemoglobin is glycosylated, has glucose attached to it because your glucose numbers are always normal. But what is abnormal is amount of insulin in your blood in this scenario. Your insulin number has gone up because your pancreas is producing more insulin. And that this is where the hormone difference has already started. The harm has already started. You're going to have those side effects of having high insulin. And if you could, and I guess the idea is you need to know if you are in this gray zone, this pre-diabetes, this the kind of, and you won't know till you look. I can't think of another way than looking at the insulin levels, and you may have years or decades of head start if this is the screen. So this is
there's kind of the a fascinating side bit on that is there's what appears to be an insulin independent mechanism for glucose uptake in the myocytes at least, and that's based off of exercise. So you end up independent of insulin level, you'll put more GLUT transporters in the muscle cell during an exercise. I mean, he talks about this type 1 diabetic, who doesn't produce insulin and doesn't take insulin because he walks vigorously for like 2 or 3 hours a day or something, which is kind of fascinating. That
How does that work? Where do they get the insulin? Because they don't need, they're reducing their need for insulin, is what you're saying.
Because by doing exercise, there's some sort of cellular mechanism to put GLUT transporters in the membrane when you exercise. So you're disposing of that glucose during that exercise, which, great for that person who has type 1 diabetes. I mean, it's awesome, but also for anybody, right? Exercise, you're going to get potentially that benefit too, right? You're going to not only be using the glucose there, but you can be uptaking it better.
So it's possible a pure type 1 diabetes theoretically should not produce any insulin, and because insulin is important for other cells as well, not just the muscle cells. So I feel like they will still run into big problems like DKA without any insulin. But if you have a type 1 diabetic who's still producing little insulin and not zero, I can see them getting away by relying much more heavily on exercise, because the other critical organ could still function because they have some insulin signal. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know about that. It's a good point. I mean, how does does glucose get across the blood-brain barrier without some sort of transport? Is it passively diffused? I don't, because the brain is the heaviest user, right, of the glucose. So like you would have to have, I don't know if that's insulin dependent or not. I guess it's not.
Well, certainly. Actually, I don't know either. I'm sure we can look it up, but there's definitely organs that need insulin, and you can't. I mean, if you don't make any insulin, there are definitely critical organs that won't work. Like not having any insulin is in a way incompatible with life. You need that hormone to have some critical cells that give them access to glucose that they need. it's also fascinating. I don't understand why type 1 diabetes exists. Just evolutionary doesn't make sense. It's just one of those autoimmune things that I'm like, why get rid of this particular hormone that affects kids? And if you look at it, it used to be a death sentence, right? I think we looked into like Novo Nordisk history and how before humans, always changing their environment and trying to play God, we figured out how to first extract all this insulin from other animals, I think pigs and cattle, um, and then literally saving lives of these kids who had type 1 diabetes, and they were most likely going to die. But this very crude way of giving them, and they're not measuring units correctly, is just like, hey, I got this little cocktail, injecting into the blood or muscle, and just but they lived. And then
Right.
that was less than 100 years ago that started. And now we're at a point where we have refined it. We don't need animals anymore. I think we can make all this stuff in lab now. Um, and to the point that most of the insulin is not even used in type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes insulin use is like less than 10%. Most of the time, again, like if you're studying this, looking at this from this kind of metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes from an insulin centric point of view, it, it kind of doesn't make sense that we treat type 2 diabetes with insulin, especially if it's done long term. I think there is value in if someone just found out they have really bad type 2 diabetes, and insulin will get you down to normal looking glucose numbers, because that's kind of what pancreas does. It upregulates or downregulates your insulin production as it needs to. But you are still exposing somebody with, I mean, there's a reason the body has insulin resistance, right? There's a reason. Um, Oftentimes, when you have too much glucose, your pancreas is producing a lot more insulin, but there comes a time either your pancreas cannot produce more, or your body starts fighting back. Your body starts saying, I have enough storage. I understand our body has a lot of access to food. Our food sensor is going up, but I just don't have any capacity. So can we please, shoving food into our body? And by giving more insulin, you're just overcoming this mechanism and just kind of, trying to get super diabetes and
Right.
super insulin metabolic syndrome when you think of long term. So the only healthy way of dealing with these type 2 diabetes is trying to decrease your insulin needs over time. But like I would say the first couple months is okay, as as you make big changes. But a year after your diagnosis, you're in the same amount of insulin, like something has not clicked. Either like that did this the doctor patient relationship, did they need to figure this out? Maybe I don't know whose fault it would be, but the goal should be to get off insulin for type 2 diabetes as soon as possible, because that would be the healthiest long-term um, decision for the patient, which which is kind of funny, because how much like insulin prices, like all drug prices in America as a whole, is discussed. And yes, I mean it's that every type 1 diabetic should have great access to insulin, and nobody can really argue with that. But I think we can accomplish that if we reduce, if how much insulin is consumed by the type 2 diabetes industry. Like if we can push all the insulin away from them and make that available to type 1 diabetes only, I mean, I think it will be a win-win for everybody. Maybe not the companies that are making a lot of insulin, but often
Right.
the same companies making GLP-1s, I think they'll be okay too. So,
Well,
do you have anything to add there? I think I talked a lot.
no, I mean, yeah, I think So yeah, I think this chapter is important because it lays the foundation for metabolic health, and I think it ties in so well to the things in the later chapters.
Yeah.
But
And I think a lot of people are already becoming. I think it's almost a buzzword now. Insulin resistance, almost to the point that people are trying to sell. I'm sure there's some social media scams that's like insulin resistance. We'll get you tested. Come here, and some of them may be actually great services. But the point is, I think a lot of it's not a new term for people. A lot of people have become just like a lot of people know the soda is probably bad for you. A lot of people have started to learn that insulin resistance is a bad thing. Yeah, and they're willing to take steps to reduce their insulin resistance, uh, which is great. But next we can also you want to move to chapter 7, which is kind of heart disease. What do you think?
yeah, or we could do the. Did you have some articles or something?
Oh,
I don't know if we want to
like the HIV one,
do what.
the
Or yeah,
HIV one we had
did you
discussed.
have? I don't know if is that. Did you have any that one or anything else? I don't know if you may want to
So we can when we basically we can
wind
end
down.
we can end the metabolic syndrome talk here, and then we can next time pick up. Now we established what metabolic syndrome is, and we have kind of said insulin is a bad thing, especially high levels of insulin can have all these harmful things that people don't necessarily realize. We'll start next time maybe with heart disease, um, and we can go down all the problems that happen with obesity and diabetes and maybe blood pressure even. I feel like there are simple things, but sometimes not fully understood. Okay,
Yeah.
so we're gonna talk about some cool news in healthcare. The one that came to my attention was this HIV CRISPR thing. So it sounds like I think this they have been talking about using CRISPR technology for HIV, and for a lot of other diseases. But I think what was the breakthrough here? I think maybe they finally showed it in a lab that it works. That they're finally in a lab setting using CRISPR technology are able to remove HIV virus from the cell. Um, so yeah, so it's not FDA approved or anything, but it's a great proof of concept. I think 10 years ago it was theoretical, but finally they have at least shown it can work in cells.
Because the virus essentially incorporates the uh, DNA within the cell, right?
Correct.
Is
So
it
it's one of those viruses, kind of like herpes virus, where these viruses have this enzyme. Because last time we talked about how there are kind of 3 layers to this genetic code. There's the DNA, that kind of a long-term storage of data on like a hard drive, and then you use the DNA to make a copy of mRNA or RNA, I should say, just as a generalized thing. And the RNA is probably people familiar with, when they got COVID vaccines from Pfizer, Moderna. That was those kind of RNA-based vaccines. And then the RNA copy is used to actually produce the protein, which will be the third layer of the central dogma of genetics. Um, a lot of viruses carry copies of genetic code either in RNA form or some even in DNA form. And some viruses, not all, have the ability to um, sneak in permanently a copy of their genetic code. It'll have to be DNA version of either they had DNA to begin with, or they have RNA code, and they still create a DNA copy for for um, you know implanting into our DNA purposes. So the ultimate goal of the virus is, even if the virus dies, it can come back later because it has injected this DNA into your cell's DNA. So whenever the cell makes proteins for itself, it will activate, whatever the scenario might be. It'll activate it'll basically make fresh virus, even the virus has been taken care of by the immune system and is actually, or medications, and it actually does not exist anymore. It will make new virus. So you can never get rid of this virus. And the best example is the herpes virus, because you can have that cold sore and it goes away, but then 20 years later, boom, it's back, and you're like, what happened? It's because a copy is part of that nerve that goes from your cold sore and lives all the way back, I think in your brain. But at some point, that DNA gets activated, the gene gets activated, and then the herpes comes back and then dies again and then comes back. So similarly, HIV is a virus, and everyone's familiar with HIV. And right now, thankfully we have a lot of good medications to really treat it. These medications basically stop all the reproduction that happens with the virus. It makes copies of itself, but you can never cure HIV because it does implant that DNA into the human DNA. But maybe with this, you can reverse that. With this technology, once they test it on humans and gets FDA approval, it's possible that humans will be able to just take it, and it'll happen is these enzymes will be part of the solution, where they'll go in, figure out where the HIV DNA is, cut the DNA there, remove that piece, and kind of weld the DNA back together. And then that piece is destroyed, and then you will never have HIV again. That's what I described there is what CRISPR is. CRISPR is this, based on the problem you're trying to solve, it is this highly specific scissors that kind of scan and find the pattern you're trying to go for, and then cuts there, removes the DNA, or sometimes you want to inject a DNA. So it makes that editing, it cuts where it needs to be cut, adds or removes the DNA, whatever you're trying to accomplish there, and then kind of seals the holes and kind of makes it look new again. And then letting you wait, and now you kind of edited your gene, and which is kind of cool. It's a tool. It's cool, but I'm sure there's some negative things that can happen. But FDA just approved something similar for sickle cell for patients who have um, hemoglobin that doesn't work properly in sickles. I think we talked about sickle cell last time.
Mm-hmm.
But now you can use FDA, trials. Human patients have gone through trials and done well. These patients used to have to go to ER over and over again because they continue to have these crises where they have excruciating pain. But now they have added a gene that produces a different type of hemoglobin for them that prevents them from having sickle cells. So it's life changing. It's ultimately a cure for something you used to take medications for, like in HIV. You could potentially have a cure whenever this goes through trials. So
Right.
it's hugely exciting, and just proof of concept. I think more and more diseases, especially that have an easy genetic solution, one gene solution, are a great target for such therapies.
On a similar note, in and going back to the insulin, there was an article in Popular Mechanics
Okay.
5 days ago about this genetically engineered cow in Brazil, Sao Paulo. A team of researchers from the University of uh, Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and University of Sao Paulo, they engineered a cow embryo, 10 actually, and it doesn't say how they did it, if they used CRISPR or what they used, but essentially they engineered genetically the embryo to produce proinsulin in the mammary gland. So one out of the 10 embryos implanted and created a calf, and now it's producing milk. And in the milk, not only does it, they were just hoping to get proinsulin out of it, and then they could convert it, but it's actually producing 3-to-1 insulin to proinsulin in the milk. So they're hoping that with this method, they can extract the insulin. They could basically increase the world supply of insulin by genetically engineering these cows.
Interesting. So it's not
And
where you drink the insulin. Like you can't just eat insulin, I think. So, but it's the idea is to extract it out of the milk, not just give the milk to people who need insulin.
I think so. I think so, but it also the levels, because it's produced in the mammary glands, the levels within the body aren't like within the cow aren't abnormal. They're able to kind of maintain their own homeostasis.
So it doesn't affect the cow. I see.
Right. It's just like in their milk.
Interesting. Because before they had to slaughter the animal and get to the pancreas to get to the insulin.
Right.
So
Right.
here, I think you're okay. Okay, it makes sense. You figured out a way to not have to hurt the animal.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I mean,
Interesting.
yeah, it's kind of cool.
So I thought they were already using a laboratory technique where the insulin was synthetic and could be done.
Yeah, they use bacteria now.
Yeah, they use bacteria. So
it's genetically engineered bacteria, but this is, I guess, yeah. Why is it better? Why is it? I don't know.
Is it kind of just cool? Like, hey, we can do this.
The process far outpaces the typical process for creating insulin, which involves transgenic yeast and bacteria. If a transgenic cow created 1 gram of insulin per liter, a typical that dairy cow produces 40 to 50 liters a day. So it's an immense amount of insulin. Apparently, it's like, yeah, like they can produce more than what they can from the bacteria or yeast. Interestingly.
Okay. What'd be interesting is if this could be like, you could use some sort of genetic therapy too, especially in type 1 diabetics, kind of reintroduce insulin production. So sometimes the problem is not necessarily insulin production, but the receptors aren't there because of autoimmune reasons. So, and autoimmune problems are much difficult to solve because we don't really understand if it's one gene issue, many genes issues. So if we figure that out, that would be huge for many different autoimmune diseases.
Because type 1 diabetes tends to develop like over a child's lifetime, right? They could be born okay, and then the autoimmune disease starts
Yeah,
to
it kicks in
creep
like
in.
age 8, 10, it just kind of kicks in out of the blue, though. It's possible that the process started earlier and, it's just like a slow burn of the pancreas. But that's typically the story. And it's just because even if now we see these patients who are like 20 and 21, they're struggling with, because they have to live a life that is not normal.
Right.
And doing that as your, teenager, from like what, I don't know, 12 to 20, and that's basically a teenage lifespan, that whole decade. It's so hard because there's so many social pressures to conform. And now it's just it just makes adherence to the insulin therapy so hard, and people go through a lot of preventable harm. They just have days of just high, like they could have been type 1 diabetic, but their A1Cs may be very high, and suggesting their average glucose levels in the blood have been very high, causing neuropathy, kidney disease, blindness, all those kind of things. Diabetes is such an ugly disease. It's incredible. It's incredible how much damage it can do.
Yeah, for sure. You got any more interesting articles?
No, that's the only one I have. Like I love the possibilities of CRISPR.
There was one about the increased prevalence of colorectal cancer
Hmm.
in younger adults. I think
Nope.
that's kind of already been. I don't. There's not. It's just. I'll just mention that. I mean, we're seeing colorectal cancer in younger adults. We don't know why, which is why the screening guidelines changed from 50 to 45.
I think
Um,
anecdotally, like working in the hospital, I mean, we keep seeing this, and we always wonder if it's just because we see the bad cases, or is this something changing? But there's good evidence to suggest this is actually a change in in how early the disease is presenting now. We don't know why, but it's a scary change that it looks like what we have observed is being confirmed by independent studies.
I had to guess. I would say microplastics are the cause.
It's hard to say no. I mean, it's what we know about cancer. It's probably inflammation related. Metabolic syndrome could cause inflammation. You know, anything in the gut that's toxic. I mean, microplastic, maybe those PFAS things in the water. But it's let's just say, I mean, it's getting rid of microplastic is probably a good thing for for all organic life.
Right.
Uh,
I mean, you would think if it was some like some people are like cell phones or like increased cell signal, increased radiation exposure, but you would think that that would increase your risk for all types of cancer and not just colorectal. So I don't know, and I don't know. You would think colorectal cancer maybe even be less impacted by that because it's shielded, but at least a little bit by
other body parts.
that. Yeah, I mean the thyroid or the breast
Well, you
or
would think skin cancer
yeah,
would be the biggest, right? Because it's
right, right,
exposed.
right.
Uh, but also, I mean,
Um,
we understand like there's different aspects of radiation. You know, ionizing radiation is much high energy. It's like gamma rays, X rays, much higher energy than visible light because light is a type of radiation. So we know those kind of higher energy frequencies cause cancer. Lower energy frequency than the light being the standard that we expose all the time. We don't think actually does anything to cause cancer. It's not like it causes less cancer. It should cause zero cancer. And that's the reason, you know, everybody's okay with Wi-Fi devices now. I can see the desire to like, well, this is, you know, my cell phone is emitting, you know, Wi-Fi and 5G and all these signals. It's and the idea of it's passing through me, it's unsettling. And I can see, you know, especially if you, I can understand the desire to connect the two, but based on the physics we understand so far, there should be zero connection to, you know, radiation coming from your phone, unless your phone for some reason is emitting ionizing radiation, which I guess I don't know much about. I mean, I don't know why it would,
you
but
would think they would. You would think they would have figured that out if that's the case. They would
yeah,
have been
especially
measuring
yeah,
that
like
and
some society would have detected it.
right.
Like that, there's a lot of incentives. I mean, someone would have banned it by now. I mean, clearly, like you know, like if you go to Chernobyl, you're gonna find ionizing radiation. That's completely separate. That's you know much higher frequency, the big particles. That's not what we're talking about here. Um, but like you're talking about these microplastic, these kind of small permanent molecules that know will never go away. They can actually make into your cells and nucleus and interfere with the DNA and how it works.
Right.
Um,
Well, I just like the local inflammation. I could just see that. Like these foreign particles getting into they're in your intestine, right? Like there's no doubt everybody's got them. It's unavoidable,
correct.
right?
It's unless like your everything you consume. I mean you can get like a reverse osmosis water filter, and that will cut down on how much what you're getting through the water. Um, so I would think some of the yeah. So some of these molecules the Brita filter would not, because these are much shorter, much smaller than Brita filter is just kind of filtration, like a sieve. It just has pores that you have to be so smaller than the pore size to go to, and these are much smaller than that. So reverse osmosis, like dialyze machine, it can reduce concentrations of anything. So it can work, but I mean, what kind of water are they using to grow your food and the meat you
Right.
eat and the crops? And I mean, do you ever eat out? I mean, it's from a point of, can you reduce your risk? Yes. Can you remove your exposure? Well, you'll have to start from you won't have to, you can be like breastfed. You have to go through, use homegrown formula. I mean, it's the problems is everywhere. So
Yeah, it's everywhere. It's like you can't avoid it.
like I think there was like for the PFAS things that show up in like the Teflon chemicals that did you know, do you know about these stories? The Teflon chemical, the PFAS, the short chain carbon with fluoride on them.
I know what the PFAS is, but
Okay,
what is
okay.
it?
So it's a bit same thing. Like I think made by DuPont and initially used for Teflon things. And like if you into house building, those kind of wrappers that they put around the house, that anything that you're talking about a semi-permeable, remember that lets moisture out, uh, but also have or keeps the moisture out, but allows the air to flow back and forth. So that's kind of what your house has, that layer wrap around it. Then where you go, in the snow, ski sports, you have those jackets, Gore-Tex, keeps you dry, but it's all like these chemicals that we figured out actually they actually cause cancer, and everybody's blood has these chemicals now, and only people who don't have only blood samples that don't have these chemicals is like samples collected in the Korean War. They were collected before like humans figured out we can create these chemicals. So
Yeah.
I think there are like already lawsuits going against these companies, but like the damage is done, and it's a huge problem, and we think it's carcinogenic, and they keep changing. They went from I think the government's banned like the 8 carbon molecule, so they went to 6 carbon molecule because technically that wasn't tested to be cancer proven. But now,
Mm.
so they started using that, and now we're like, oh, I think that also causes cancer. So it's just,
Wow.
it's like,
I can just imagine them being embedded with, I don't know, intracellularly, but definitely within the folds of the intestine and colon, like it just causing a local inflammation, chronic
yeah.
local inflammation.
And maybe we'll come up with a bacteria. I feel like bacteria are just so cool, or fungus. Fungus and bacteria can always figure out to break something apart. Even
Yeah, that's kind of
right now,
cool.
it seems like it's forever, but these organisms break anything apart. Just give them the time, because that's
Right.
how coal was. I think coal existed. This is one of my buddies told me. It's basically like wooden material that fungus didn't know how to break for the longest time and got solidified. And we have coal, but since then fungus have figured out how to break wood to a point that we will never have more coal again after the current supplies go away. So it's same thing with plastic. I think sometimes hear news, oh, scientists figure out how to break plastic using bacteria, and I'm like, cool, or algae or something.
Yeah.
That's how it's good. So maybe that'll be the thing, or maybe a tapeworm. Maybe the solution is get the parasite, and they will get rid of the microplastic somehow.
Right. Right. Take your tapeworm. Let's market that bottle of tapeworm.
Oh my god.
Well, one more to scratch your itch.
Oh, that's nice.
Busy doctors are now told it's okay to use ChatGTP to ease workload. What do you think of that? There's an article about using
I
chat to
mean,
workload.
First of all, who's telling them? Is it like their companies or their souls?
No, it's a where was it, in Kentucky or North Carolina? Somewhere, some hospital system. They're okay with
So
um
I think I'm
using it.
probably in the minority. I think there's a great need for ChatGPT in medicine because I think I think medicine just doesn't scale well. It's just like one person taking care of one patient, and oftentimes working long hours, tired. So I think, just borrowing from what the airline industry did, getting the smartest autopilot systems they could come up with and putting a fully trained pilot in charge of the oversight, I think makes sense to society. Obviously, there are legal aspects to this, there's emotional aspects to this, which I don't understand. I mean, I understand, but they're difficult to navigate. But my belief is if we allow for um, automation and better training of LLM models and let them loose on healthcare, it will certainly be a huge win for patients. Will there be some patients who get hurt, um, because I mean it's kind of like the self-driving thing, right? The self-driving cars is supposed to be a lot safer, as a group now than regular drivers. But I think um, healthcare is a industry where the benefit of LLMs hugely outweigh the the potential of harm. And I'm looking into the future. That we share data, we use a lot of data to train, we test it fully. 10, 20 years later, I mean, absolutely. Like if I'm a patient, I would feel better with doctors using these models to be more thorough than not. And
Right. It's gonna be a collaboration between the human and the system, right? Like,
yeah, and I think it'll also do a lot for access to care. I mean, right now, the health. We can at some point also talk about how the healthcare system works. I mean, there's so many gatekeepers. Like it's so hard to. I mean, first of all, doctors know all this information on how the body works, after going through like a decade or more of schooling and training. And even then, a doctor knows about their field. Like if you have a question about a different organ or different field, let's go to a different doctor, and they have different hours. They're busy. Then you have that's just one layer, and then you also have to figure out when you can take time off from work, and then how are you going to pay for this, or are you going to use your insurance? Would they accept that insurance? um, and then what the bill is going to be. I mean, from a regular person, there is friction because at the end, the person's like, "Ah, I'll just don't worry about it now, since it's not that big of a problem." But if you remove all that and just from patient's point of view, you think of a world where you're getting your lab work done maybe um, on your own accord. I mean, regularly, and there's a system that's kind of just in the background monitoring. Like, hey, I noticed, your breathing has changed, or your heart rate has changed. You're not working out as much as you are. There's just that silent monitoring in the background, who's been programmed to just do the best thing for the patient. I think they can do more. They can answer questions easily and smartly and for free for the patient, and they can be proactive in detecting early signs of problems.
all right.
And obviously,
I like it from an administrative standpoint. That's my biggest thing. It's like,
you're talking about note writing, like extracting information, you letting you be a doctor with the patient, writing, the AI. You just forget about everything. Technology becomes magic. You,
writing the note, which is already the. I mean, ever since you and I have talked about it, I've seen ads for at least two different companies that offer that. Two different apps that have that. I haven't done either
Yeah,
one of them yet.
and I
But
know we're working on it too. I mean, and Epic is working on their own model of like listening to a conversation and putting that into a note.
not just that, but summarizing the current research, or you know, yeah, just looking at all the data that we have. The latest research, the what's in books, like what's written about medicine already, what you learn in medical school,
Yeah,
what you learn in
that's
residency.
the thing. So I mean, the task is, what is the truth, synthesizing all the latest available information, knowledge, evidence together with the question, and then translating it into layman's terms accurately. I
Yeah,
mean,
they said only 4 of the 140 summaries devised by ChatGTP contain serious inaccuracies. One of them omitted a serious risk factor for health condition, being a female. Another one was due to semantic misunderstanding by the machine model, while the others were due to misinterpreting trial methods, such as whether they were double blinded. So, for the most part, out of 140 summaries, it was accurate.
I mean that's remarkable. The level of accuracy,
Right.
that's above 99%.
Yeah. I mean,
So
I think it's like taking that information with your own medical background. And again, it's going to get better with time, like you said, after multiple iterations and but just taking that information with your own, what you're seeing with the patient, I think that's for our generation, that's what it's going to be, you know.
yeah, and I think it's not just this, because I think the other benefit is it's the whole world is going to benefit from this at the same time, because the companies that are going to be involved, I mean, they're likely, and I know, I mean, I think Google is working with some Indian hospitals, and I think all the big tech companies you're going to have obviously American patients who on a global scale are um, actually very fortunate, and I'm compared to, there's like China, India, Africa, South America, where access to care is probably much, much worse than
Mm.
the West, the European and American systems. Like there, if you can give those people access, using smartphone as a platform to a lot of um, solid, accurate, easy to understand advice in their native language. I mean, if you can accomplish that, I mean, that is huge. You're there. Take That's a huge leap going from, well, the near doctors lives like 2 hours away, and I work at a farm, and so I'll have to catch a bus next month to see them, and at the level of care where like I'm looking to get that free cataract surgery so I can continue to work for 10
Right.
years. I mean, going from that to like, oh wow, what does everything mean? What should I eat? Infectious diseases, like my son has ear pain. What does that mean? I mean, you can ask so many smart questions, where you're not just suffering when the rest of the world. But you're not just suffering because of where you're born, because of your zip code, where the rest of the world has completely different access to care. So I think that's cool. I mean, and we're just talking about access to knowledge. We're not even talking about nutrition, antibiotics, vaccines, all those good things. So I think that will come. But I think as
Right.
right now we're in this world, people who have access, everybody has internet access, I think, at this point, but you don't know what is true. Those, like
Mm.
you get exposed to everything at once. It's overwhelming, and 10 different people will tell you different things. And what is missing is, well, the truth can't be 10 different things. Truth for me has to be the truth, and um, so if these systems can find the truth, um, and give really educated, up to date answers, I mean, that is a miracle I didn't think I would see in my lifetime. Because even Google search is giving you access to what people have created. For the first time, we're going from role of internet being connecting to you to different articles and posts. For the first time, we're going to a system where like you ask the smart computer a question and it gives you the correct answer.
Right.
This is like a genie. Like, what is my question? What is the answer? Oh, done.
Right. And it's yeah. Well, another application they like the Attia talked about HDL and how we don't really know what HDL means. Like HDL cholesterol, when you measure that, what does it mean? So one thing you could is like taking the data that's available in the research and taking all of that and creating a hypothesis slash a research direction for it. Like this is what's being shown, and this is what direction you should try to take this kind of thing. Giving, you know what I mean? Like somehow directing research in the right way.
Yeah,
Find an
absolutely.
answer.
I mean, and they're already doing that with the protein stuff, right? The alpha protein that Google DeepMind had come up with, where they're modeling possible candidates or drug trials, like just trying to come up with molecules that would make sense before they even do any of the study.
Yeah.
So that's just kind of like it's basically coming up with random models that have high probability of, like, if you put two carbons here, one nitrogen here, and this hydroxyl group here, there's a high likelihood, probabilistically speaking, that this will help with, make your
Yeah.
diabetes drug more effective.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
future is exciting. CRISPR is
We're in the
exciting.
beginning, man. We're right here.
This
We're
is
ready
telling you,
to.
humans keep the pace of change the humans do to the environment keeps accelerating. I mean, 100 years ago, we're the coolest thing was, like, I don't know, railroad. Actually, planes had come into being. Like 200 years ago was probably like 150 years ago was probably railroad was like the coolest thing that you could figure out in America. And then 100 years ago, I think smart or planes, cars, the Roaring Twenties. And then what, 30 years ago, we figured out the computer, we could connect people through internet. And now we're just like, everybody's got a phone in their pocket. I know what's happening in Baltimore and China and Japan instantly. And I mean, these companies like Google and Facebook, like they're talking to billions of people constantly. They're helping billions of people talk to each other for free. We don't even have to. I mean, 20 years ago, we had to call. Thinking about international call, we had to think about getting a paid card, pay like $6 a minute or something ridiculous. And now
Right.
it's like, oh no, like there's so many apps that'll do it for free. It's incredible, incredible.
Yeah.
All right, man. The future is exciting, and we'll continue to dig deep into metabolic syndrome. It's very important.
Cardiovascular disease next.
Cardiovascular heart disease, and you'll explain to me what is atherosclerosis.
That's you, man. I don't deal with that. I just put well, I don't deal with any of that.
It'll be interesting. I think it's still abstract. I understand the insulin stuff so much more than atherosclerosis. Like, I know the pathophysiology. I mean, people won Nobel Prize. We know LDL is very important, but like, why do we even have it? Like, it doesn't make sense because maybe it's just we're living long enough that we build plaques. It's incredible.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Till next time. Thank you.
All right.
All right.